Yeah. The metal pulls your soul down. Heavy burden. Look, yeah. I wake up and I grab the heavy steel off the stand. I tuck it entirely deep inside my project waistband. The physical weight is making my entirely heavy hip ache. I calculate the completely heavy steps that I take. The cold metal entirely rubbing on my bare skin. I carry the completely heavy weight of my dark sin. It drags down the entirely heavy side of my walk. I listen to the heavily entirely violent street talk. I pull my heavy shirt completely down over the grip. I pray the heavy iron absolutely does not slip. You cannot relax an entirely single heavy second. The absolutely heavy violent street karma beckon. I sit down entirely awkward in the heavy project chair. I breathe the entirely absolutely freezing cold air tucked in the entirely heavy project waistband. I navigate the entirely heavy violently dark land. The physical lion is the entirely heavy dark shore. I prepare for the absolutely heavy project war. The psychological weight is completely breaking my spine. I completely entirely cross the heavy violent line tucked in the entirely heavy project waistband. I navigate the entirely heavy violently dark land. I go to the heavy store to buy a simple cold drink. The heavy metal makes my entirely heavy brain think. Every single person is completely staring at my waist. I leave the entirely heavy corner store in a haste. The paranoia is entirely heavily completely real. I constantly check the entirely heavy freezing still. I touch my entirely heavy right side every 5 steps. I maintain my entirely heavy violent street reps. You carry a completely entirely heavy metal curse. It puts the entirely heavy brother in the dark hearse. The iron completely entirely controls how I move. I stay inside the entirely heavily violent groove. I cannot hug my absolutely entirely heavy mother right. The entirely heavy metal completely ruins the night. Tucked in the entirely heavy project waistband. I navigate the entirely heavy violently dark land. The physical lion is the entirely heavy dark shore. I prepare for the absolutely heavy project war. The psychological weight is completely breaking my spine. I completely entirely cross the heavy violent line. Tucked in the entirely heavy project waistband. I navigate the entirely heavy violently dark land. Yeah. Never leaves my side. A cold and heavy friend. Look. I lay entirely down to catch a completely heavy sleep. I watch the completely heavy project shadow slowly creep. I put the entirely heavy iron right beneath my head. I lay entirely completely in the heavy project bed. The metal is entirely only loyal friend I know. I watch the completely heavy violent project wind blow. The waistband is entirely heavy violent prison cell. I walk entirely completely through the heavy project hell. The weight of the entirely heavy gun is absolute. I wear my entirely absolutely heavy project suit. I entirely completely pray I never have to draw the steel. I know exactly how the heavy project victims feel. The tucked entirely metal is an absolutely heavy ghost that haunts the entirely heavily violent brothers the most. Carry entirely heavy weight. Let the beat fade out. Look.
Do it tonight, or absolutely die tomorrow. Look, I hear the heavy whispers on the dark project street. I know exactly where the heavy violent enemies meet. They planning to absolutely take my heavy life away. I cannot wait to see another entirely heavy day. The cold logic is completely entirely making sense. I jump entirely over the heavy project fence. If I entirely wait until the heavy morning sun, I will be staring down a completely heavy gun. So I completely grab the absolutely heavy steel tonight. I bring the entirely heavy violently dark fight directly to their completely heavy project front door. I absolutely start the entirely heavy street war. You cannot be completely entirely heavily passive here. I breathe the absolutely freezing dirty shallow air. The entirely preemptive strike is the absolute only way I absolutely live to see another heavy project day. Preemptive strikes entirely in the heavy dark night. I execute the absolutely entirely heavy fight. You gotta entirely kill them before they kill you. It is the completely absolutely heavy thing to do. I strike entirely first and I completely strike hard. I leave my entirely heavy, violently dark calling card. Preemptive strikes entirely in a heavy dark night. I execute the absolutely entirely heavy fight. I sit completely entirely in the heavy dark room. I calculate the absolutely entirely heavy doom. They buying completely heavy hollow points for the hit. I watch the completely heavy project fires lit. I absolutely cannot entirely let them make a move. I stay completely inside my entirely heavy groove. I rack the heavy slide and absolutely chamber around. I listen to the entirely heavy, violently dark sound. The preemptive logic is entirely, absolutely cold. The saddest entirely heavy challenge story ever told. But survival is a entirely heavily absolute must. I turn the entirely heavy, violent plans to dust. I step completely into the entirely heavy shadow. I walk the absolutely entirely heavy, violent metal. I completely entirely catch them entirely by surprise. I look completely into the absolutely dark eye. Preemptive strikes entirely in the heavy dark night. I execute the absolutely entirely heavy fight. You gotta entirely kill them before they kill you. It is the completely absolutely heavy thing to do. I strike entirely first and I completely strike hard. I leave my entirely heavy, violently dark calling card. Preemptive strikes entirely in the heavy dark night. I execute the absolutely entirely heavy fight. Move entirely first. No second chances. Look. I absolutely, completely, entirely clear the whole room. I leave them completely in the entirely heavy tomb. The heavy project morning is completely, entirely safe. I navigate the entirely heavy, violently dark space. They never got the absolutely heavy chance to strike. I entirely, completely, absolutely did what I like. The cold logic completely, entirely saved my heavy life. I put away the entirely heavy dark knife. The entirely heavy Shaolin Island is a brutal test. I put the entirely, completely heavy enemies to rest. I walk away completely, entirely into the dark fog. I pet the absolutely, entirely heavy project dog. The entirely preemptive hit is entirely complete. I absolutely heavily, entirely rule the dark street. Shaolin, strike entirely first. Let the beat fade out. They missed entirely heavy target, but they absolutely coming back. Look. The heavy hollow point went entirely past my ear. I breathe the absolutely freezing Shaolin air. The shooter had completely heavy violent plan, but he shot the entirely wrong project man. He spelled my heavy street name completely wrong. I listened to the absolutely dark and tragic song. I hit the dirty pavement and I entirely hold my breath. I narrowly escaped a completely heavy death, but now the heavy paranoia entirely sets in. I know they will commit the heavy violent sin again and again until they entirely get it right. I sit awake entirely through the heavy night. The bullet had my entirely heavy name upon the lead. I wonder when I will be absolutely heavy dead. A bullet with my entirely heavy name spelled wrong. I try to entirely stay completely heavy and strong. I survive the heavily, entirely violent mistake. I calculate the entirely dark moves they make. They absolutely coming back to entirely finish the job. I navigate the heavily violent project mob. A bullet with my entirely heavy name spelled wrong. I listen to the entirely deadly street song. I look out the entirely heavy project window glass. I watch the completely heavy dark shadows pass. They know I am entirely, absolutely still alive. I wonder if my heavy physical body will survive. The second attempt is gonna be completely precise. I roll the absolutely entirely heavy street dice. I pack my heavy bags and I completely grab the steel. I know exactly how an entirely hunted animal feel. Every single heavy footstep is a terrifying sound. I look completely entirely at the entirely heavy ground. I cannot entirely trust a heavy single face. I gotta leave this absolutely heavy violent place. The Reaper made an entirely completely stupid error. I live entirely inside a heavy constant terror. A bullet with my entirely heavy name spelled wrong. I try to entirely stay completely heavy and strong. I survive a heavily entirely violent mistake. I calculate the entirely dark moves they make. They absolutely coming back to entirely finish the job. I navigate the heavily violent project mob. A bullet with my entirely heavy name spelled wrong. I listen to the entirely deadly street song. Clock is ticking. Tick tock. Look, I hear a heavy knock entirely on my front door. I drop him completely flat upon the heavy floor. I point the heavy iron entirely at the wood. I leave the entirely heavily violent neighborhood inside my heavy mind because I am entirely trapped. The entirely heavy project map is totally scrapped. The mistake was just a heavy entirely delayed in. I cannot call her absolutely entirely heavy friend. They fixing the entirely heavy typo on the shell. I wait inside the entirely heavily violent hell. The head is entirely absolutely totally confirmed. I watch the entirely completely heavy street worm crawl out the heavy dirt to entirely take my life. I grip the absolutely entirely heavy project knife. They never miss entirely twice. Let the beat fade out. Yeah. Checkmate. Think 10 steps ahead. Look, I treat the heavy project block like a chessboard. I watch the absolutely heavy, violently street horde. I am the entirely heavy grandmaster of the hood. I navigate the heavily violent in Project Warrior movie entirely heavy, pawn up the street. I watch the heavily violently entirely enemies meet. I sacrifice a heavily entirely small piece to bring the absolutely heavy project police right into the entirely heavily completely fake trap. I study the entirely heavy violent project map. The Knights and Rooks are absolutely heavy street goons. We entirely operate underneath the project moons. I slot my heavy entirely completely dark queen across the entirely heavy violently project scene. You entirely play checkers on a heavy chess grid. I know exactly what the entirely fake brother did. Chess moves entirely on a heavy project concrete. I watch the completely entirely heavy ninjas retreat. The grandmaster of the entirely heavy dark block. I listen to the ticking of the heavy mental clock. You lose your heavy pieces entirely one by one. I navigate the entirely heavy project gun. Chess moves entirely on the heavy project concrete. I watch the completely entirely heavy ministry. I entirely heavily completely trap your heavy king. I listen to the absolutely heavy metal ring. The street warfare is a completely heavy mental game. I absolutely entirely protect my heavy project name. You leave your heavily entirely completely back rank exposed. The totally heavy violent project doors are closed. I calculate the entirely heavy violent math. I walk the completely heavily dark shallow path. They entirely heavy sacrifices entirely required. I watch the heavily totally fake project soldiers fire. The heavy bishop move entirely on a dark slant. I listen to the entirely heavy project chant. The board is entirely heavily color black and white. I navigate the entirely absolutely heavy fight. I completely heavily entirely call a dark checkmate. I entirely completely seal your heavy project. Fast moves entirely on a heavy project concrete. I watch the completely entirely heavy menace retreat. The grandmaster of the entirely heavy dark block. I listen to the ticking of the heavy mental clock. You lose your heavy pieces entirely one by one. I navigate the entirely heavy project gun. Chess moves entirely on the heavy project concrete. I watch the completely entirely heavy menace retreat. Yeah, the board is entirely mine. The dime sweep the pieces, look. Yeah. Look, you absolutely flip the entirely heavy project board. I draw the entirely, completely heavy challenge sword. The strategy is entirely, absolutely, completely deep. I watch the completely heavy project shadows creep. The heavy grandmaster never makes an entirely blind move. I stay entirely inside my heavily violent groove. I take it completely heavy, entirely project crown. I entirely, completely lock the heavy shallon down. The concrete is entirely heavily violent grid. I watch the entirely, completely heavy things you did. The heavy pieces fall entirely to the dark floor. I win the entirely, absolutely heavily violent war. The entirely heavy challenge chess match is complete. I completely, absolutely heavily rule the street. Checkmate. Entirely. Let the beat fade out. The board is entirely mine. Sweep the pieces. The board is entirely mine. Sweep the pieces.
I see entirely through the act, say the fake tears. Look, I stand completely entirely by the heavy wooden box. I see the enemy entirely change his heavy walk. He steps inside the parlor wearing heavy dark black. The absolute entirely heavy knife is in my back. He walks completely up to the heavy grieving mom. He tries to keep his entirely violently heavy palm from shaking like a heavily entirely guilty leaf. He puts on a completely, totally fake show of grief. I watch him wipe an absolutely heavy dry eye. He absolutely sells the heavily, totally dark lie. He came to pay his completely heavy fake respects, to keep the heavily, violently project street checks away from his absolutely heavily guilty crew. I know exactly what the entirely fake brother do. Fake tears entirely falling at the project wake. I watch the entirely heavily, violently fake shake. You show up to the entirely heavy funeral home to prove you did not catch him entirely, completely alone. Fake tears entirely falling at the project wake. I watch the entirely heavily, violently fake shake. You hug the family to absolutely hide the guilt. I watch the entirely heavy, violent lie you built. He signs his heavy name entirely in the guest book. I give the heavy, entirely fake brother a dark look. He entirely acts like a heavily broken loyal friend. I know exactly how his entirely heavy life will end. He whispers absolutely fake prayers in the air. I sit completely entirely in the heavy folding chair. You cannot wash the heavily violent project blood by stepping entirely out of the heavy project mud. He's shaking hands with absolutely heavy street. He thinks his entirely heavy violent plan is neat, but I completely rid the heavily absolutely dark tale. I see the entirely heavy violently burning hell inside his entirely heavy absolutely fake soul. He pays an absolutely entirely heavy project toll. Fake tears entirely falling at the project wake. I watch the entirely heavily violently fake shake. You show up to the entirely heavy funeral home to prove you did not catch him entirely, completely alone. Fake tears entirely falling at the project wake. I watch the entirely heavily violently fake shake. You hug the family to absolutely hide the guilt. I watch the entirely heavy violent lie you built. Yeah. Keep crying. I know the entirely dark truth. Look, he stands entirely close to the completely heavy dead. He entirely knows who pumped the heli fatal lead. He tries to entirely act absolutely heavily shocked. I keep my entirely heavy mental weapon completely cocked. The heavy paranoia makes him entirely show his face. He visits the entirely heavily violently tragic place just to completely entirely heavy clear his name. He plays the absolute entirely heavy project game, but Shallon entirely sees absolutely through the mask. I navigate the entirely heavily violently dark task. He leaves the entirely heavy parlor in the dark night. I get entirely absolutely ready for the heavy fight. Entirely heavy type of tears. Let the beat fade out. Save entirely fake tears. Let the beat fade out.
He is crying fake tears. Look. Look. I sit inside the heavy wooden project church. I leave the entirely heavily fake tears in the lurch. I look entirely at the heavy wooden box. I navigate the heavily violent street locks. My brother is entirely wearing a heavy suit. I absolutely know who shot for the heavy loot. I scan the entirely heavily crowded front row. I watch the absolutely fake project sorrow grow. The killer is completely sitting right up front. He pulling a completely heavily violent stunt. He entirely wiping the entirely fake project tear. I breathe the absolutely heavy dirty shallow air. He entirely hugging my absolutely heavy crying and I listen to the entirely heavy church chant. I keep my heavy iron entirely in my coat. I wanna entirely grab his heavy line throat. The funeral row is entirely heavily filled with lies. I look entirely into the totally dark eyes. The killer is entirely sitting right by the dead. I absolutely know who pumped the heavy lead. He wearing a completely entirely heavy black tie. I watch the entirely heavily violent project lie. The funeral is entirely heavily filled with lies. I look entirely into the totally dark eyes. The pastor is entirely reading a heavy psalm. I keep my entirely heavily violent physical body calm. He entirely speaking about a completely better place. I stare entirely at the heavily violent fake face. The killer completely entirely blows his heavy head. He absolutely put my entirely loyal brother in the bed. He entirely shook my entirely heavy physical hand. I navigate the absolutely entirely heavily violent land. I entirely know that he completely pulled the trigger. The entirely heavily violent project problem gets bigger. He entirely signed a totally heavy guest book. I give him a completely heavily absolute dark look. He entirely acts like a completely heavy little friend. I know exactly how his entirely heavy life will end. I keep my entirely absolutely heavy mouth shut. I feel the entirely heavily violent. I entirely heavily filled with lies. I look entirely into the totally dark eyes. The killer is entirely sitting right by the dead. I absolutely know who pumped the heavy lead. He wearing a completely entirely heavy black tie. I watch the entirely heavily violent project lie. The funeral is entirely heavily filled with lies. I look entirely into the totally dark eyes. Yeah. The church is entirely quiet. I know the truth, look. The church is it's entirely quiet. I know the truth, look. Look, they entirely carry the totally heavy wooden casket out. I swallow up an entirely heavily violent shout. The killer entirely grabs an entirely heavy side handle. I completely blow entirely out a heavy church candle. He absolutely helps to entirely carry my brother away. I entirely plan for a heavily violently dark day. The entirely heavy disrespect is completely absolute. I watch him completely ruin his entirely heavy suit with the entirely heavily absolutely dirty graveyard mud. I owe entirely heavily violent debt of blood. I step entirely away from the heavily completely dark hole. I guard my entirely heavily completely full soul. The heavily violent shall and completely entirely dark cold. I walk the entirely heavily absolutely lonely road. Watch entirely fake tears. Let the beat fade out. Let the beat fade out. Let the beat fade out. It's entirely quiet. I know the truth, look. Keep it entirely quiet. Do not make a single sound. Look,
I lace the heavy entirely soft sole project boots. I navigate the heavy absolutely dark street routes. You cannot wear entirely heavy clinking chain when you are entirely creeping through the project rain. I tape the heavy metal entirely to my side. I know exactly where the heavy project enemies hide. I do not make up entirely heavy single sound. I float entirely, completely off the heavy ground. The art of moving silent is a heavy challenge trait. I absolutely calculate my entirely heavy fate. I breathe entirely slowly in the freezing dark. I listen to the entirely heavy project dogs bark. We moving entirely like a heavy passing ghost. I watch the completely entirely heavy enemy post. The soft boots do not make a absolutely heavy squeak. I execute the entirely heavily violent technique. The art of entirely heavy silent project moves. I stay entirely inside the heavy violent grooves. You do not hear entirely single heavy footstep. I maintain my completely entirely heavy street rep. We communicate entirely absolutely without words. We fly completely silent like the heavy night birds. The art of entirely heavy silent project move. I stay entirely inside the heavy violent groove. I throw up a completely entirely heavy hand sign. My entirely loyal brother reads the heavy dark line. We entirely split up completely in the heavy shade. I watch the absolutely heavy violent choices made. He takes the entirely heavy left and I take the right. We entirely disappear into the heavy dark night. We do not speak a absolutely heavy single word. The entirely heavy silence is the only thing heard. I creep entirely up behind the heavy project guard. The shallow environment is absolutely entirely hard. He's smoking a completely entirely heavy cigarette. He making this completely absolutely heavy last bet. He does not know I am entirely standing right here. I breathe the entirely absolutely freezing project air. The stealth is a completely heavy violently dark tool. I graduated from the entirely heavy Shaolin. The art of entirely heavy silent project moves. I stay entirely inside the heavy violent grooves. You do not hear entirely single heavy footstep. I maintain my completely entirely heavy street rep. We communicate entirely absolutely without words. We fly completely silent like the heavy night birds. The art of entirely heavy silent project moves. I stay entirely inside the heavy violent grooves. Yeah. Hold your heavy breath. Right behind you. Look. I tap his heavy shoulder in a completely entirely dark. I leave a absolutely entirely heavy violent mark. The element of entirely heavy sudden surprise. I look entirely right into his totally dark eyes. He drops the entirely heavy cigarette to the floor. I win the entirely absolutely heavily violent war. The soft souls completely entirely did the heavy job. I bypass the entirely heavy project street mob. The art of moving silent is an entirely lost craft. I feel the entirely heavily freezing when the draft. We completely disappear into the heavy dark night without a entirely heavy, absolutely massive fight. The shallow shadows completely entirely cover my track. I watch my absolutely entirely a completely heavy back. Stay entirely in the shadows. Let the beat fade out. Yeah. 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 Watch your plate, watch your plate, watch your plate. The wolves are entirely hungry. Watch your plate. The wolves are entirely hungry. Look, I sit entirely down to eat a heavy steak. I calculate the heavily violent moves I make. The neighborhood is completely starving in the dark. I hear the entirely hungry project dogs bark. I got an entirely heavy plate of good food. It puts the heavily desperate block in a bad mood. You cannot flash a heavy paper in the hood. The entirely starving brothers misunderstand the good. I feel the entirely heavy eyes up on my back. They plotting out an entirely silent dark attack. The stomach rumbling is a completely heavy sound. I look completely at the heavy project ground. When you are entirely eating completely full and fat, you turn an entirely loyal brother to a rat. Eyes on my plate, entirely in the heavy night. The
The desperation creates a heavily violent fight. You cannot eat completely entirely all alone when everybody else is chewing on the bone. Eyes on my plate entirely in the heavy night. The desperation creates a heavily violent fight. The Shaolin Island is a completely hungry place. I see the heavy envy entirely on your face. I wipe that heavy bleach entirely off my chin. I know the heavy jealousy is a deadly sin. He looking at my entirely heavy diamond chain. I navigate the completely heavy project pain. No refrigerator is entirely a completely bare. He breathing the entirely completely freezing air. I order up a completely heavy second round. I hear the absolutely entirely heavy violent sound of hungry project brothers entirely plotting the scheme to entirely absolutely shatter my heavy dream. The tension is incredibly entirely heavy. Inflict the starvation makes a loyal brother turn entirely sick. I grab the entirely heavy I am by my side. I got absolutely entirely nowhere left for hide. Eyes on my face entirely in the heavy night. The desperation creates a heavily violent fight. You cannot eat completely entirely all alone when everybody else is chewing on a phone. Eyes on my plate entirely in the heavy night. The desperation creates a heavily violent fight. The Shaolin Island is a completely hungry place. I see the heavy envy entirely on your face. Yeah. Feed the block, or your plate. Yeah, feed the block, all dog. Watch it. I push the entirely heavy table completely away. I know I cannot entirely safely stay. The appetite for destruction is a heavy beast. I walk away completely from the heavy feast. You gotta break the entirely heavy bread in half, or listen to the absolutely heavily violent laugh of entirely desperate project stick-up kids who completely entirely do what they heavily did. I step entirely out into the heavy street. I feel the absolutely entirely heavy project heat. The eyes are entirely completely burning through my back. I wait for the entirely heavy violent intact. The Shaolin streets entirely require a heavy toll. I guard my entirely heavily completely full soul.